In the blood-soaked streets of revolutionary Paris, where the guillotine's blade fell daily, and mercy had become a forgotten virtue, one execution stands apart from all others, not for its method, but for its unspeakable brutality. The death of Princess Marie Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, known as the Princess de Lamballe, represents perhaps the most savage act of mob violence in an era already defined by unprecedented cruelty. What happened to this 42-year-old noblewoman on September 3rd, 1792, would shock even the hardened revolutionaries who witnessed it. The Princess de Lamballe was no ordinary victim of revolutionary justice. She was the closest confidante of Marie Antoinette, a woman whose loyalty would ultimately cost her everything. Her execution was not simply a killing, but a deliberate act of psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of the imprisoned royal family. The revolutionaries knew that by torturing and mutilating Marie Antoinette's dearest friend, they could inflict a wound upon the queen deeper than any physical harm they could cause directly. Before we descend into September 3rd's horrifying mob violence, hit that subscribe button for Medieval Spirits, because what you're about to discover is how Princess de Lamballe, 42 years old, Marie Antoinette's closest friend, earning 150,000 livres annually as superintendent of household, refused to flee France despite warnings when revolution erupted in 1789, choosing loyalty over safety. How she was arrested August 19th, 1792, after Tuileries Palace was stormed, held 2 weeks at La Force prison in filthy conditions with common criminals while refusing to denounce monarchy or testify against Marie Antoinette despite constant pressure. How, on September 3rd, during the September massacres, 5 days of systematic slaughter claiming over 1,000 lives, she was dragged before makeshift tribunal and demanded to swear oath, denouncing monarchy and condemning Marie Antoinette. She refused calmly, but firmly. How the mob's reaction was instant. Death to the friend of Antoinette, leading to gauntlet beating, stripping, sexual violence, systematic torture with deliberately prolonged suffering. And how after death they decapitated her, mounted the severed head on pike, styled the hair, and applied cosmetics for recognition, then paraded through Paris streets to Temple Tower, where guards forced Marie Antoinette to look from window. The queen fainted upon seeing her friend's mutilated head, while mobs celebrated below. This is how loyalty became a death sentence, and friendship became psychological warfare. Now let's go back to 1789 and watch a woman choose honor over survival in revolutionary France's darkest hour. Marie Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan was born September 8, 1749, into the noble House of Savoy, one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious royal families. Her early life was marked by both privilege and profound loss experiences that would shape her into the devoted and tragic figure she would become. At 17, she entered an arranged marriage with Louis-Alexandre de Bourbon-Penthièvre, heir to one of France's wealthiest noble families and cousin to King Louis XVI. The marriage, typical of aristocratic unions, was more political alliance than love match. The young prince was known for his dissolute lifestyle, gambling, and numerous affairs, hardly the ideal husband. The union lasted barely 1 year before tragedy struck in May 1768, when the prince died suddenly, possibly from syphilis, contracted through his promiscuous behavior, leaving his 18-year-old widow devastated and alone. Rather than retreat from court life or remarry, the newly widowed Princess de Lamballe chose to dedicate herself to service and friendship. Her grief had transformed her into a deeply compassionate woman who sought meaning through helping others. It was this quality that would soon bring her into the orbit of another young woman struggling with the pressures of royal life, Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born Dauphine who had recently arrived at Versailles. The friendship that blossomed between them was genuine and deep, built on shared experiences of loss, displacement, and the suffocating expectations of court life. Marie Antoinette, Homesick and struggling to adapt to French customs found in the princess, a kindred spirit who understood the loneliness that could exist even in the grandest palaces. When Marie Antoinette became queen in 1774, she created the position of superintendent of the household specifically for her dear friend, a role that came with significant influence and a generous salary of 150,000 livres annually. This appointment would prove to be both blessing and curse, elevating the princess to unprecedented power for a woman at court, while also making her a target for those who resented the queen's Austrian origins and perceived extravagances. As the 1780s progressed and France's financial crisis deepened, the political atmosphere became increasingly toxic. The princess watched with growing alarm as pamphlets became more vicious, as crowds grew more hostile, and as even moderate voices began calling for radical changes to the monarchy. Yet, through it all, she remained steadfast in her support for Marie Antoinette, becoming a pillar of strength during the queen's darkest hours. The friendship between the two women had evolved beyond mere companionship into something approaching sisterhood. They shared everything: hopes, fears, secrets, and sorrows. Picture this bond. You've spent nearly 20 years as someone's closest confidant, been present for the births of royal children, served as surrogate mother when official duties kept the queen occupied. This deep emotional bond would ultimately seal your fate because in the minds of revolutionaries, your loyalty to Marie Antoinette made you equally guilty of crimes against the people. And when revolution erupted in 1789, you would face the choice that defines your legacy. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, like a powder keg that had been building pressure for decades. Years of financial crisis, social inequality, and political incompetence had created a perfect storm of resentment that would ultimately sweep away not just the monarchy, but much of the old aristocratic order. For the Princess de Lamballe, who had spent her entire adult life within the protective bubble of Versailles, the revolution represented an existential threat to everything she held dear. By 1791, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. The royal family's attempted flight to Varennes had been thwarted, and public opinion had turned decisively against the monarchy. The princess found herself in an increasingly precarious position, as her close association with Marie Antoinette made her a prime target for revolutionary justice. Friends and advisors urged her to flee France while she still could, to seek safety in the courts of Europe, where her noble birth would be protection rather than liability. The princess faced an agonizing choice that would define her legacy. She could abandon her friend and flee to safety, preserving her life but betraying the deepest bond she had ever known. Or she could remain loyal to Marie Antoinette, fully aware that such loyalty might cost her everything. For a woman who had defined herself through service and devotion, there was really no choice at all. She would stand by her friend regardless of consequences. The decision to remain in France was not made lightly or impulsively. The princess understood the risks better than most, having witnessed the revolutionary crowd's capacity for violence and having read the increasingly vicious attacks on the royal family in the revolutionary press. She knew that her name appeared regularly on lists of enemies of the people, and she was aware that several of her noble friends had already been murdered by revolutionary mobs. Yet the princess's sense of honor and duty ran deeper than her fear of death. Her decision was also influenced by her deep religious faith, which taught her that earthly suffering was temporary, while honor and duty were eternal. She believed that God would protect her if it was His will, and that if death was to be her fate, then dying for loyalty and friendship was a noble end. This spiritual conviction gave her the strength to face the approaching storm with remarkable courage and dignity. As 1792 dawned, the princess could see that the situation was rapidly becoming untenable. The royal family had been transferred from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where they lived under virtual house arrest. Revolutionary sentiment was reaching fever pitch, and calls for complete abolition of the monarchy were growing louder each day. The princess knew that time was running out, but still she refused to abandon her post. You're probably wondering what finally sealed her fate, whether it was a single moment of defiance or a gradual accumulation of refusals. The answer came on August 19th, 1792, when revolutionary forces stormed the Tuileries and the princess's loyalty transformed from admirable virtue into prosecutable crime. The war that France had declared against Austria and Prussia in April 1792 only intensified revolutionary fervor and suspicion of anyone with aristocratic connections. The princess, with her foreign birth and royal associations, was seen as a potential traitor who might be working with France's enemies. Rumors and accusations swirled around her, painting her as everything from a spy to a corrupting influence on the queen, all of which made her position increasingly dangerous. The princess's final test came in August 1792, when revolutionary forces stormed the Tuileries Palace and massacred the Swiss guards who had been protecting the royal family. The king and queen were arrested and imprisoned in the Temple Tower, while their associates were rounded up and held for trial. The princess, despite her noble birth and international connections, could have claimed diplomatic immunity or foreign protection, but she chose instead to share the fate of her friends. On August 19th, 1792, the Princess de Lamballe was arrested and taken to La Force prison, one of the most notorious detention facilities in revolutionary Paris. The prison was overcrowded, filthy, and dangerous, a far cry from the elegant apartments she had known at Versailles. Yet even in these degrading circumstances, the princess maintained her dignity and continued to express her loyalty to the royal family, refusing to denounce the monarchy even when it might have saved her life. The conditions at La Force were deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of political prisoners and extract confessions or denunciations. The princess was held in a cramped cell with common criminals, denied adequate food and sanitation, and subjected to constant verbal abuse from guards and fellow prisoners. The revolutionaries hoped that these conditions would force her to renounce her royalist beliefs and provide testimony against Marie Antoinette. Picture this: 2-week ordeal. You're 42 years old, accustomed to luxury and comfort, now sleeping on filthy straw surrounded by criminals who mock your noble birth. Guards remind you daily that one statement against the queen would win your freedom. Fellow prisoners tell you about the mob violence they've witnessed, the aristocrats beaten in the streets, the executions that grow more frequent. You know that September is approaching, and with it, something terrible, though you cannot yet know the specific form that revolutionary vengeance will take. Despite the physical and psychological pressure, the Princess de Lamballe refused to compromise her principles. She spent her days in prayer and meditation, drawing strength from her faith and her conviction that she was suffering for a just cause. Fellow prisoners later testified to her remarkable composure and kindness, noting that she shared what little food she had and provided comfort to other inmates struggling with their circumstances. And her steadfast refusal to cooperate with her captors only increased their frustration and anger, making her a symbol of aristocratic defiance that needed to be broken to demonstrate the power and determination of the revolutionary government. The September massacres of 1792 represent one of the darkest chapters in the French Revolution, a period when mob violence reached unprecedented levels and the last vestiges of civilized justice were abandoned. These killings were not spontaneous outbursts of popular anger, but organized campaigns of terror designed to eliminate enemies of the revolution and intimidate anyone who might oppose the new order. The Princess de Lamballe's execution was perhaps the most shocking example of the barbarism that characterized this period. The massacres began on September 2nd, 1792, following news that enemy armies were advancing on Paris and rumors that imprisoned nobles and priests were planning to escape and join the invaders. Radical leaders like Jean-Paul Marat and Georges Danton whipped the population into a frenzy of paranoia and bloodlust, convincing them that extraordinary measures were necessary to save the revolution. What followed was 5 days of systematic slaughter that claimed over 1,000 lives. The mobs that carried out these killings were not composed of criminals or outsiders, but of ordinary Parisians, shopkeepers, artisans, laborers, who had been convinced that their revolution was in mortal danger. They had been told that the prisoners they were murdering were traitors who deserved death, and they approached their grisly work with a sense of patriotic duty. This ordinariness of evil, this transformation of neighbors into executioners, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the September massacres. On September 3rd, 1792, the mob's attention turned to La Force prison, where the Princess de Lamballe had been held for 2 weeks. Word had spread that the Queen's closest friend was imprisoned there, and the crowd had worked itself into a fury over her symbolic importance. She represented everything they hated about the old regime: foreign influence, aristocratic privilege, and unwavering loyalty to the monarchy they were trying to destroy. The princess was dragged from her cell and brought before a makeshift tribunal that had been set up in the prison courtyard. This was not a legal proceeding in any meaningful sense, but a piece of revolutionary theater designed to provide a veneer of justice to what was essentially a lynching. The judges were members of the mob, drunk on power and bloodlust, who had already decided her fate before she appeared before them. Picture this courtyard scene. You're pulled from your cell into bright September sunlight, blinking against the glare. Around you stand hundreds of people shouting, cursing, demanding your death. 3 men behind a table pretend to be judges, but you can see the blood already on their hands from earlier trials. They're going to ask you questions with only one acceptable answer, and you know with absolute certainty that you cannot give them what they want, even though refusal means death. The tribunal's questions were perfunctory and designed to trap rather than enlighten, and what they demanded would force the princess to choose between her life and everything she believed in. The tribunal demanded that the princess swear an oath denouncing the monarchy and declaring her loyalty to the republic. They wanted her to condemn Marie Antoinette as an enemy of the people and to provide testimony that could be used in the Queen's eventual trial. Most importantly, they wanted her public submission, her acknowledgement that the old order was dead and that the revolution had triumphed. The Princess de Lamballe's response was characteristic of the courage and dignity she had shown throughout her ordeal. She calmly but firmly refused to take any oath against the monarchy or to say anything that might harm Marie Antoinette. She acknowledged that she could not swear loyalty to principles she did not believe in, and she expressed her willingness to accept whatever punishment the tribunal might impose. Her composure in the face of certain death impressed even some of her enemies. The mob's reaction to her refusal was swift and savage. They had wanted her humiliation and submission, but her dignified defiance only enraged them further. Someone in the crowd shouted death to the friend of Antoinette, and within moments, the princess was being dragged from the tribunal toward the prison gates. What happened next would shock even the hardened revolutionaries who witnessed it, and would remain one of the most horrifying examples of mob violence in human history. The Princess de Lamballe was forced to run a gauntlet of attackers, who beat her with clubs, stones, and whatever weapons they could find. Contemporary accounts describe how she was stripped of her clothing and subjected to sexual violence before being murdered. Her suffering was deliberately prolonged as the mob wanted to extract maximum terror and humiliation from her death. The brutality was not incidental to their purpose, it was the purpose itself. Picture this from the mob's perspective. You've been told for weeks that this woman represents everything wrong with France: aristocratic privilege, foreign influence, loyalty to the hated Austrian queen. Now she's here before you, refusing to denounce the monarchy, maintaining her dignity even in prison rags. Her refusal feels like personal insult, like she's mocking your revolution by refusing to acknowledge its legitimacy. Your rage needs outlet. And the leaders who whipped you into this frenzy have made it clear that extreme violence against enemies of the people is patriotic duty. The manner of the princess's death defied every convention of civilized society and shocked observers across Europe. She was not simply killed, but systematically tortured and mutilated, her body violated in ways intended to deny her even the dignity of death. The mob's actions revealed the depths to which human beings could sink when all moral restraints were removed and violence became a form of political expression. And what they did to her body after death would prove that this was never about justice. It was about sending a message so brutal that it would haunt Marie Antoinette for the remaining months of her life. What made the Princess de Lamballe's execution particularly horrifying was not just its brutality, but its calculated psychological impact. The revolutionaries knew that Marie Antoinette would learn of her friend's fate, and they wanted to ensure that the queen understood exactly what awaited anyone who remained loyal to the monarchy. The princess's death was intended as both revenge and warning, a demonstration of the revolution's power to destroy not just its enemies' lives, but their very humanity. The most shocking aspect was what happened after her death. In an act of unprecedented barbarity, the mob decapitated her corpse and mounted her head on a pike, but this was only the beginning of their macabre ritual. Contemporary witnesses describe how the crowd then paraded through the streets of Paris, carrying the severed head like a trophy while chanting revolutionary songs and celebrating their victory over aristocratic tyranny. The mob's bloodlust was far from satisfied by the princess's death. They subjected her body to further mutilation, cutting it into pieces that were distributed among the crowd as grisly souvenirs. Some accounts describe how her heart was cut out and eaten by members of the mob, though these reports may represent the mythologizing that often surrounds particularly shocking historical events. What is certain is that her remains were treated with a savagery that shocked even contemporary observers who had become accustomed to revolutionary violence. The severed head of the Princess de Lamballe became the centerpiece of a grotesque procession that wound its way through Paris toward the Temple Tower, where Marie Antoinette was imprisoned. The mob wanted to ensure that the queen saw what had become of her dearest friend, and they took deliberate steps to make the head recognizable despite the violence it had suffered. Witnesses described how they had styled the princess's hair and applied cosmetics to create a horrifying parody of her former beauty. Picture this procession from a bystander's perspective. You're a shopkeeper on Rue Saint-Antoine watching this parade approach. At first, you hear the singing and shouting revolutionary songs mixed with obscene chants. Then you see the pike rising above the crowd, something mounted on top that you can't quite make out. As they get closer, you realize with horror that it's a human head, but not just any head. The hair has been carefully arranged, the face painted with rouge and powder, styled to look almost lifelike. The crowd is laughing, celebrating, treating this mutilated corpse as entertainment. Some are drunk, others are sobering up, and starting to look uncomfortable with what they've done. But the momentum carries them forward toward the Temple Tower, where the real purpose of this horror show will be revealed. The procession to the temple was a carefully orchestrated piece of psychological warfare, and what happened when they arrived would achieve exactly the effect the revolutionaries intended. When the mob reached the Temple Tower, they demanded that the guards force Marie Antoinette to look out her window at the princess's severed head. The queen initially refused, but the crowd's threats became so violent that she was eventually compelled to witness the horrifying spectacle. Contemporary accounts describe how she fainted upon seeing what had become of her friend, and how the sight haunted her for the remaining months of her life. The psychological impact of this forced viewing cannot be overstated. Marie Antoinette had already endured the loss of her throne, her freedom, and her way of life. But the sight of her friend's mutilated head represented a new level of cruelty that shattered whatever hope she might have retained. The revolutionaries had succeeded in their goal of breaking her spirit, demonstrating that they could reach her loved ones even in death and subject them to unimaginable degradation. The mob celebration continued for hours after the princess's death, with crowds gathering in taverns and public squares to drink and carouse in honor of their triumph. The severed head was carried from place to place like a totem, with different groups taking turns displaying it and recounting the details of the execution. This communal celebration of violence revealed how thoroughly the revolution had corrupted normal human emotions, transforming murder into entertainment and cruelty into virtue. The treatment of the Princess de Lamballe's remains also reflected the revolutionaries' desire to erase not just their enemies' lives, but their very memory. By denying her a proper burial and distributing her body parts as trophies, they were attempting to prevent her from becoming a martyr or symbol of resistance. They wanted her death to serve as a warning rather than an inspiration, a demonstration of what awaited anyone who opposed the revolution. The international reaction to the princess's execution was one of horror and revulsion. European courts, already alarmed by the revolution's excesses, saw in her death proof that France had descended into complete barbarism. The detailed accounts that circulated throughout Europe served to harden opinion against the revolutionary government and contributed to the formation of the coalition that would soon wage war against revolutionary France. Even within France, many moderate revolutionaries were shocked by the brutality of the September massacres, and particularly by the treatment of the Princess de Lamballe. Her execution marked a turning point in the revolution, demonstrating that the radicals were willing to embrace any level of violence to achieve their goals. The execution had immediate consequences for the royal family imprisoned in the Temple Tower. Marie Antoinette's mental and physical health deteriorated rapidly after witnessing her friend's death, and she never recovered from the psychological trauma of that September afternoon. The king, too, was deeply affected by the loss of the princess, whom he had known and respected for decades. Their children, particularly the young Dauphin, were traumatized by their parents' visible grief and by the knowledge that such violence could reach even those closest to them. The revolutionary government's treatment of the princess's death was revealing of their broader strategy and mindset. Rather than expressing regret or attempting to distance themselves from the mob's actions, radical leaders like Marat openly celebrated the execution as a necessary act of revolutionary justice, arguing that the princess's loyalty to the monarchy made her a traitor to the people and that her death served as proper warning to anyone who might consider opposing the revolution. September 3rd, 1792. Princess Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, 42 years old, Marie Antoinette's closest friend, earning 150,000 livres as superintendent of household, faced makeshift tribunal after 2 weeks in La Force prison, where she refused to denounce monarchy or testify against the queen. Despite filthy conditions and constant pressure, when demanded to swear oath against monarchy, she refused, calmly but firmly. The mob's instant reaction: death to the friend of Antoinette, followed by gauntlet, beating, stripping, sexual violence, systematic torture with deliberately prolonged suffering. After death: decapitation. Head mounted on pike, hairstyled and cosmetics applied for recognition, paraded through Paris streets to Temple Tower, where guards forced Marie Antoinette to look from window. The queen fainted upon seeing her friend's mutilated head. So here's what you need to understand about the Princess de Lamballe. The mathematics weren't about revolutionary justice or political necessity. They were about recognizing that loyalty can become a death sentence when governments demand betrayal as proof of patriotism, that friendship becomes psychological warfare when executed publicly to break imprisoned survivors, that refusing to compromise principles, even when torture and death are certain, requires courage. Most people never need to discover, they possess. The princess chose to remain in France, despite warnings, 1789 onward, refused to flee when friends urged safety over loyalty, maintained dignity through 2 weeks at La Force, refusing to cooperate, then faced tribunal, knowing refusal meant death, but gave it anyway. The mob's brutality wasn't incidental, it was calculated psychological warfare designed to torture Marie Antoinette through her friends' mutilated remains. Subscribe to Medieval Spirits and share this video so others understand how political extremism transforms ordinary people into instruments of calculated cruelty. Leave a comment telling me which historical period best demonstrates similar principles. Loyalty prosecuted as treason, psychological warfare through loved ones' suffering, mob violence justified as patriotic duty, and systematic dehumanization of political opponents. Because here's the real lesson from September 3rd, 1792. When revolutionaries demanded the princess denounce her queen and she refused, despite knowing the consequences, she proved that some bonds transcend self-preservation and some principles are worth dying for. 2 weeks of filth and pressure, one tribunal demanding betrayal, one refusal given calmly, and hours of mob violence culminating in severed head paraded to break a queen's spirit. Sometimes loyalty costs everything, and the Princess de Lamballe paid that price, proving friendship could survive even revolutionary France's darkest hour.